Hello, folks. Thank you all for joining, and thanks to everyone who is making this launch event happen. Thanks to our hosts, IFIS and the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund, including Olivia Monroe, Kayla Goodson. Thanks to our sponsor, the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group. Thanks to Nathan Kohlenberg and Krisha Sikora, my two brilliant co-authors on the new paper that we are discussing today, which is called Autocrats Within. And most of all, to our two panelists who are leading experts in Turkey and Poland, respectively. Johns Hopkins Science Professor Lisel Hintz is a noted authority on the Turkish state and society, as well as struggles over various forms of identity, whether it's national, ethnic, religious, gender, otherwise, and how identity spills over into foreign policy. And Dr. Cassandra Emmons is a expert on Polish judicial backsliding, as well as democracy data at IFIS, where she leads the data analytics and visualization team and manages the election guide and researches ways to deter autocratization. In a couple of minutes, we will turn to each of them to dive into Turkey and Poland, respectively. And I know that everyone who's listening is going to have questions for our panelists, so please do write those into the chat box for the Q&A later. But first, let me take a couple of minutes to explain why we're talking about these two countries, which are obviously both very different. It's because, for one thing, these are the two most consequential elections of the year in 2023, among other things, because of the country's strategic position around Europe's now all-important eastern flank, but also because democracy is on the line in both countries. The process and the results of these elections could have lasting effects. And in terms of who is threatening these democratic processes, in both cases, it's less foreign authoritarian regimes than it is the autocrats within Turkey and Poland. That is a stark fact. The two most important elections of this year will be subverted by domestic autocratic corruption. It's like a somber correction to the self-satisfied talk that we heard at, for example, the Summit for Democracy, about how democracies are outpacing autocracies given developments in Ukraine, Iran, China, US midterms, all really important facts, developments on the ground. But all of us in the international community who care about defending democracy need to focus on these two election seasons over these next 6 months, to go into them with clear eyes about how exactly Erdogan and Kaczynski and their regimes, they compromise the rule of law via court packing and states of emergency, take over the media via regulatory capture and cronyism, abuse power in campaign finance and election administration, and politicize other power centers throughout their societies, whether it's church leaders giving election sermons in Poland or Turkish soldiers holding machine guns at heavily Kurdish polling stations. I will let our panelists go on with more details and cases, examples, and ways to think about that. There's obviously, like I said, important differences between these two countries, and they're not small differences. Autocratic efforts are twice as bad in Turkey as they are in Poland. That's one of the things that makes it interesting to look at these two countries, because they essentially bookend the 40% of countries in the world that are hybrids between consolidated democracies and authoritarian regimes. So Poland on the upper end, not having had a fair election since 2015, Turkey on the lower end, now completing a longer descent, almost, towards not even being free and becoming consolidated authoritarian regime. They sort of illustrate the range of severity among autocratic efforts that make elections free but unfair. So we identified in our paper these toolkits by closely reviewing the election observation findings and other reporting from the past 2 or 3 elections in each country, and then supplementing that with context around how corruption courses through each of these political economic systems. And starting with Turkey, our paper goes through how 2011 was about the time when Erdogan was starting to become more brazen, showing his autocratic colors outwardly because he was winning his struggle against the generals and then able to do so. And then in 2016, his repression kind of going into overdrive, and then since then bringing Turkey to freedom's edge. And so now with Erdogan down 10 points, the question is he going to get off the tram, as he once described the process of democracy as a temporary vehicle towards a destination? He may try to stay in power by making next month's Turkish election the first in decades that's not just unfair, but also unfree. He's already exploiting the post-earthquake state of emergency and banning ever more political opponents, and could, of course, also refuse to step down. So, Lisel, tell us, will the Turkish election even be free?
Thank you so much, Josh. Thanks to everyone who put this together, for organizing. Thanks to my co-panelists. I'm very glad to be here and speak about this. And it's interesting, Josh, that you mentioned that Turkey and Poland are such different countries, but as a comparativist, it's hard for me not to see the immense similarities in terms of the ways that the regimes have been consolidated, have been de-democratized over the past few election cycles. And in response to the question of, are the elections on May 14th? So here we're looking at just, 2.5 weeks away. Are they going to be free? We know that they're not fair. And I think it's important to kind of differentiate what we mean by those things. Speaking of fair elections in terms of sort of access to be able to campaign, access to media, is the sort of playing field equal for all those who are contesting the elections? And it's absolutely the case that is not true in Turkey. And you mentioned some of the sort of overarching ways that we can think about that. But if you look at the consolidation of the media in government hands is really important. The government, both through formal institutional control, but also through construction contracts and banking contracts and mining contracts and with holding companies that own media stations, means that the government has immense influence over private media as well. So, there's a lot of censorship by private media stations. There's a lot of sort of towing the government line on those private television channels. They've passed many, many social media laws that means that, something could be tagged as disinformation very easily. Insulting the president is criminalized, right? So there's lots and lots of ways in which this is not fair. If you think about institutional capture, the stacking of the judiciary that you mentioned, the influence that the regime has over the Supreme Electoral Council, I think is going to be really pivotal in this case. And we've seen both in the 2018 presidential elections, when the Supreme Electoral Council okayed Erdogan's declaration of victory on unofficial results relatively early in the evening, and then it's kind of just a fait accompli, to the 2019 elections, where the Supreme Electoral Council annuls the victory of an opposition candidate in the mayoral election in Istanbul. So we've definitely seen this incredibly important institution kind of in the pocket of the government. So fair, not a chance. In terms of free, we generally mean, can an individual cast their ballot for the party or the person or the initiative that they want without any hindrance, and will that be counted equally and for that particular candidate? And so there I would say, this is not the first time in which I think these are going to be not completely free elections. We've seen electoral violence in previous elections, particularly in the Kurdish region. We've seen ballot boxes moved. We've seen obstacles to people being able to cast their ballot for the party that they want. So all of that is to say, it's not the first time that we're going to see neither free nor fair elections. It obviously remains to be seen But the fact that, you're having numbers of political opponents jailed, the fact that there may be interferences with casting ballots having to do with the state of emergency that was in place following the earthquakes. Are people going to be able to vote in the area where they're living now? Are they able to return to the area where they were registered? There's all kinds of questions that I think are sort of up in the air in terms of what are elections actually going to look like on the day of, given the immense destruction that came after the earthquake. I think that you're right to point to this as an incredibly important kind of pivotal election. And I think the opposition has grasped onto that in being able to form a coalition of a number of various parties with very, very different ideological backgrounds. And only, I would say, in the last 2 months, being able to kind of come together and try to contest the election. But I think the question is, as much as they can put forth a united and convincing platform, the challenge really is, because these are pivotal elections of a regime that has slipped into competitive authoritarianism and a highly consolidated, as you said, executive presidency, the challenge is to make it as difficult as possible for the regime to call this in their favor, to make it as difficult as possible for the AKP to be able to say relatively early in the evening, okay, it's clear that President Erdogan has won 52% of the vote. That means we're going to stop after the first round, because this is a system in which you can have a 2-round election. So we're going to call it in the favor. And then the Supreme Electoral Council says, yep, we're going to put our stamp on that, as they have in the past. Then what does the opposition do, right? And so I think that's the important thing for us to be focusing on, and for international observers to be focusing on, is how difficult can the opposition make it for the regime to kind of be able to pull off an electoral steal. I will say that while previous polls and different polls have put Erdogan down 10 points, others are saying, and even a poll that came out yesterday, are saying that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the leader of the United Opposition Front, the Nation Alliance, is polling relatively close to Erdogan. So the question again is going to be, how many tools in the authoritarian toolkit is the AKP going to use in order to try to ensure that they are able to declare victory? Because this is because of the corruption that AKP members have engaged in during their tenure, kind of an existential election for them. They need to remain in power in order to be able to remain immune from prosecution. And of course, the opposition is going to try to do everything that it can to make sure that authoritarian toolkit just isn't strong enough. So I think it's the right question to be asking in terms of, how free or how many sort of compromises on freedom of elections are we going to see, and where should we look for them? So just to kind of close the answer to this question, I would say, look for more manipulation in the Kurdish region, because the regime in the past has been able to get away with that without people really caring that much. There's a lot of anti-Kurdish prejudice. There are multiple arrests of Kurdish politicians, journalists, political activists, and so forth. And I think that there may also be the closure of the pro-Kurdish party, the People's Democratic Party. They're running on another ticket just to make sure, but really kind of being aware of the places in which it may be easier for the government to compromise those elections, I think is really important to keep watch on.
Wow, Lisel, that was very helpful. I mean, both like a more nuanced answer than I was even like asking, is it going to be free or not? And there's like not completely free, and not for the first time, and for these reasons, and here's what to look for. That was really helpful for us to understand what the opposition is going to be trying to do. We should come back more, in the Q&A to like what the international community can do, but in particular, yeah, the risks to be watching over the next month. Let's pivot from Erdogan's playbook of cronyism and repression to Jaroslaw Kaczynski's playbook of unconstitutional party takeover, which involves controlling. It was actually helpful, Lisel, to hear about the private media. That actually is probably one of the differences, although maybe to a diminishing degree. But in Poland, it's especially the public media that has become a regime mouthpiece or party, really, and corrupting campaign finance, politicizing control over election administration, instrumentalizing the Catholic Church. That's what PiS has done to end fair elections in Poland as soon as they came into power in 2015 being the last fair election Poland has seen. And this year they're building on that toolkit with more unconstitutional laws, changing election rules less than 6 months before the election is announced in order to boost peace turnout in every rural village, and then make it much harder for the opposition oriented, including overseas voters, to get their ballots in on time. But it doesn't matter per se that it's unconstitutional, because PiS broke judicial review through partisan loyalty. And that allows them to do even worse things. One autocratic tactic that you don't see as often at that upper end of the hybrids, and is a sign that you're maybe closer to the lower end, like Erdogan's Turkey, which we just heard about, is prosecuting your political opponents, including in election years, on totally trumped up charges. But that's what we're starting to see in recent days and weeks with the Polish government prosecuting Donald Tusk, which is enabled again by the severe judicial backsliding since 2015. So Cassandra, when we saw each other yesterday, you were explaining to me that that's one of the maybe even the most important of the three pillars or the dominoes that are first to fall in the process of autocratization. So could you please tell us more about that and what you expect over the next 6 months?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Josh. First of all, for moderating this really important discussion. It's a pleasure to be here with my co-panelist, and congratulations on what is a really thorough report that you and your co-authors have put together, tracing these parallel declines over the past decade or so. So, as you outline there, Poland's democracy has really been in a state of acute democratic crisis for now 7.5 years, and it's ranked among the top 10 autocratizing countries in the past decade by the varieties of democracy indicators, declining from its status as a liberal democracy to an electoral democracy. So this election, since the 2015 parliamentary election saw Law and Justice Party PiS come to power in a unified government, Poland, what was a one-time leader among the region in forging a democratic path, has undergone a really systematic attack on democratic institutions and practices from within, as your title rightly points out. But its decline started and has really taken on the veneer of a few other formerly liberal democracies, particularly in the region, in its targeting of a few specific institutions right off the bat. So if you want to consolidate power in a democracy, you start by targeting the institutions that have checks on your power. And so in Poland, where we see this happening first and foremost, right after the election in October of 2015, is the judicial branch. This institutionally provided the strongest check, constitutional check on anything that the party had wanted to do at the time and has wanted to do or done since. So what we saw was refusal to fill seats with lawfully appointed judges, and instead replacing those candidates with what have now been deemed by international courts unlawfully appointed judges. We've also seen the creation of new anti-constitutionally formed chambers and changing appointment procedures for existing bodies within the judicial system. And this is a really intricate judicial system. So we're seeing this happen at the Constitutional Tribunal, the Supreme Court, as well as through the ordinary courts. This is also extended to oversight committees within these bodies and independent ombuds that were replaced or moved from a system of appointment or election within, so amongst a body of one's peers, to direct appointments from different divisions within the government. We also saw a lowering of the judicial retirement age as a tactic to purge a huge set of judges that then opened up appointments for new politically appointed bodies to place in new judges. So this has all been done also, I should say, in the face of European level commitments, both within the European Union and the Council of Europe. And those two bodies, multiple institutions within the bodies, have really started to issue some stronger reflections on judicial independence in particular. Especially in 2021, we saw a handful of decisions come down that really were speaking to the lack of judicial independence in Poland. And I think this is something that we could look for further implications of in the elections coming up. But besides the judiciary, the other thing we see attacked is the quote unquote fourth branch of government. This is in the line of fire, the independent media. And so as you were alluding to before, targeting the media is the way that you eliminate a method of communication of what is going on behind the scenes. You eliminate any kind of criticism. So we've seen Reporters Without Borders tracks the quality of media, World Press Freedom Index over time. And we've seen Poland drop from 18th in the world in 2015 to 66th this past year. It's been a slow and steady decline. And today in Poland, the public media, TVP, is used almost exclusively for state propaganda. And as you alluded to, there is local and regional media, but these outlets are under increased pressures to sell or can be forced to close. We've seen this happen in other countries in the region where a policy of hyper-legalism means that small elements of the laws that aren't necessarily always enforced will suddenly be enforced in full. That can bankrupt these small papers, things like audits and things like that. So, that's the second pillar. That's the second line of attack we tend to see. Third, and simultaneously, we tend to see targeted attacks on civil society. So anti-democratic actors begin weeding out institutions of strength within civil society and organizations that have tended to give voice to exactly the sectors of society they intend to further ostracize. So two things worth mentioning here in the case of Poland in 2017, the NGO law created, again, new administrative bodies, continuing this practice of creating new institutions and relying on the judiciary that was already coming under party control. The two bodies are responsible for, among other things, distributing funds for NGOs to continue their work. So we see an attack featured there. And what even a casual observer of Polish politics over the past few years might vividly remember was the public demonstrations in 2020 surrounding the government's proposed anti-LGBT rhetoric and election platform, which then, yes, of course, also included policies. So these are early targets, and unfortunately, we've seen systematic attacks on all three of these in Poland. And while these actors in 2015, of course, came to power through free and fair elections, as you rightly have pointed out, that was the last time we saw those free and fair elections, in part aided by these systematic attacks on these institutions. So one of the main reasons for the free but not fair designation that the OSCE reports for the 2019 parliamentary elections was the unfair treatment in the media. And there have been subsequent changes since peace came to power pertaining to the National Election Commission itself and its structure that mirrored the changes and the arbitrary replacement of some members in the judiciary. So we see these tactics being used to dismantle multiple institutions all at the same time, which sets up a really worrying scenario for us come this next October. But I'll give a small bright spot and then hand it back over, which is that the standard Eurobarometer survey, it was conducted in January and February, asked Polish citizens, it asks all EU citizens about this state within their country, their level of faith in their government and their institutions and European institutions. But a few things that really stand out here. So only 27% of Polish survey respondents said that they tend to trust the Polish government, while 69% said they tend to distrust the Polish government. And when asked about the conditions in their country, 70% said they felt that Poland was headed in the wrong direction. So this sentiment, combined with the current economic situation and the war in Ukraine, has really created a point where we're going to see a disgruntled Polish electorate come to the polls and perhaps, issue a strong condemnation of the way that these policies have been going.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Cassandra. That was really, really helpful, and like multiple layers deeper than I was even like thinking about the pillars and the dominoes, and it actually it was really helpful. So let's turn to Q&A. Sorry, I was about to like jump into my first question because I'm like so fascinated by what you're saying. I know we're gonna have a ton of questions, and others will as well. Again, if you have one, please write it into the chat box. I'll just get us started with something that just built on what you were saying about the pillars and how it compares to what Lisel was talking about in Turkey. I guess this is more of a hypothesis that I'd like to hear your reaction to. It seems like there's a bit of a difference in how we got here, in that Erdogan had to first, in his first decade, undermine a pillar that obviously, in the context of Poland, you didn't have to mention, Cassandra, which is the old military establishment, and then only after that coming to some of the others. Whereas in Poland, when dismantling, a liberal democracy within the European Union, peace had to come in 2015 and really rapidly and aggressively lay the groundwork for its backsliding by pumping out its vitriolic propaganda and, like you said, illegally packing the constitutional tribunal. So you kind of needed that legal and political, within a liberal democracy, justification in order to then do what you want to do in terms of breaking the institutions. Does that difference sound right, or does it sound off to either of the two of you?
I could just jump in quickly and pick up on the difference. And I think there are similarities in the sense that, like the case that Cassandra is talking about, the AKP, the Justice and Development Party that Erdogan is the co-founder of, comes to power in 2002 in free and fair elections. And I would say we don't start to see a lot of concern about elections, at least, not institutional capture, but elections at least until about 2014, the local elections there. It's the case that, I think similar to Poland, they use legal means in order to consolidate their power. And so legal at first and then extra legal. For example, there are concerns about Erdogan's actual qualifications to run as president. This is, by most people's standards, his third term. And the Constitution says you cannot run for a third term, but they're kind of finding a loophole whereby, well, we switched to an executive presidency as of the 2017 referendum, and he was elected in 2018. So this is really only his second try. So they started with kind of these legal means. And frankly, military, to pick up on your point, Josh, military and judicial reform that at the time was seen as heading in a democratization trajectory. And this is the subject of my first book, which is about how the AKP uses the EU trajectory, the EU accession process, as a way to justify the domestic reforms that they're taking in terms of civil-military relations. The democratization criteria don't want a military that is constantly intervening in politics. Neither did the AKP, because the military had essentially kicked out of power one of its predecessors in the late 90s. The democratization criteria want a judiciary that has, a sort of more representative and perhaps more turnover in terms of makeup and turnover. But the AKP was able to use that, perhaps a little bit similar to the Polish case, as a way to open up, to use judicial reform and then open up the space for stacking the courts in their favor. So they're sort of using these measures that look like they're heading in a democratization criteria, and they're justifying them as part of the EU process, so that the early years of the AKP look pretty democratic. But as I argue in the book, they're very much targeted at, the military, the judicial system, those institutions that had been obstacles to the AKP and parties in its political trajectory, because the AKP is only founded in 2001, but it comes out of this tradition of political Islam. And so, I think it's really important as international observers to sort of listen to people who are experts from the region and are following the developments incredibly closely, so that we don't sort of take for granted, or we don't take as given, the fact that these measures are actually heading in a democratic trajectory. They may be sort of allowing the ruling party to reconfigure the domestic playing field in its favor. And I think that's what we saw in the AKP case.
Yeah, and I would just add, yes, this is something we're seeing in both of these cases, but not exclusively in these cases. This use of the law to undermine the law is a phenomenon that we've been seeing spread through the world. Really, every region of the world has been touched by this since at least 2010. And so, depending who you talk to, they'll call it a, different person's phenomenon, but really this attack method has been tested in multiple different fora. And I think what stands out to me about the Polish case is the speed with which they instituted a lot of these judicial changes upon taking power in 2015. And this was a bit of a learned lesson. So PiS had been in power in 2005 to 2007, and it quickly lost its a majority of its seats. So it learned from that if there were going to be changes in order to keep power, they needed to happen fast. And so that's why, by December of 2015, we already saw the undermining of the judicial system starting to take hold. And I think I'll leave it there for more questions.
Well, maybe let's just continue the story forward from the initial breaking of the institutions and knocking down of these pillars and consolidation of power to the next stage, and the one that we're most focused on talking about today, which is the elections. Tell me more about how we get from consolidating power to an unfair election. How does which are the key avenues? And how does that work after, probably not in 2015, but then in 2016 and 17, what happens with, and similarly, Lisel, you said, in 2014, that was the time when we start to see the elections suffer. What was different then? And what does that look like from coming into power towards actually seeing the effects through, you tell me, but I presume the media, election administration, and other institutions that are critical to fair elections?
Sure. So in 2018, there were also changes made to the structure of the National Election Commission, and in particular, the National Election Bureau, which by many accounts lost some of its independence. Prior to that, it was nominated and approved through judicial networks, but because of the undermining of the judiciary, all of the built-in checks and ways to keep these autonomous bodies autonomous had also broken down. So this has that was one of the earliest steps in risks to the election field. But really, the media overtaking in Poland has been really, really detrimental to this. You've basically closed off people's access to unbiased information on any of the commercial platforms. So while, like I was saying before, there are still a few smaller local independent media outlets, they're struggling against a much larger machine, and their reach is not as far as the state media is.
Yeah, I can pick up on that in the Turkey case. So you start to see institutional capture, I would say, early on in the AKP's tenure, and again, they've been in power for 21 years. You have a generation, in fact, of 7 million new voters in Turkey who've known nothing but Erdogan and the AKP. So I think thinking about the youth vote is maybe something to think about if we're getting towards maybe the optimistic side of things. But thinking about how does consolidation end up shaping elections, I'll just give a slice of that looking through the media lens, since I touched on that briefly. And I talked a little bit about judicial consolidation and kind of the defanging of the military. If we think about the way in which the AKP consolidated its power from a political economy standpoint, not an institutional takeover standpoint, but kind of the crony capitalism that allowed the AKP to have immense support from the business community. We can think about the rise of kind of this conservative bourgeoisie and the consolidation of these holding companies, these massive holding companies that, as I said earlier, are looking for low interest loans or looking for a tender to build the next bridge or the next airport or whatever that is. And so they have very close ties to the government. In some cases, not pseudo, but like partial familial ties to the government in terms of sons-in-law, but also these economic and financial incentives to toe the government line. And so the sort of consolidation of the media has happened, again, not only through formal tools, but through the crony capitalism that has allowed the AKP to maintain its vote share because people are getting economic growth, or they were until economic crisis began to really manifest itself around 2015, 2016. So this economic growth is fueled by these, corrupt relations between the government and these holding companies that are very much shaping what is on television, what is in the newspapers. 8 of 10 most read newspapers are in pro-government hands. 9 of 10 most watched television stations are in pro-government hands. So again, as Cassandra was saying earlier, that has the effect of reducing criticism, of reducing free speech, of not allowing the voters to kind of know what's actually going on. So that, I think, is really important. Another aspect of that crony capitalism that we saw was the mismanagement of the construction industry. So construction was fueling an immense amount of this economic growth. And what you saw in the wake of the earthquakes was the human cost of that, because you had all of these buildings that were built not to code, that were built in regions that were sort of banned. You were not allowed to build in those particular regions, especially after the 1999 earthquake. But builders were able to purchase an amnesty permit, essentially. The government repeatedly passed amnesty laws. And so in order to gain political patronage, in order to gain finances, from these companies, they are passing laws that allow these buildings to remain intact until they're no longer intact. And I think that's something that the public is seeing now. So there's a question too of, will there sort of be a reckoning where the public holds the government accountable for that? But all that is to say, from the institutional consolidation to the crony capitalism, to the kind of personalization of Erdogan as this figure, where for some, they can't see a country without him. He is the kind of personification of the leader that they want to see. For others, and particularly for a lot of youth, they see him as, the only thing that they have experienced, and what they're experiencing now is economic crisis, unemployment, not being able to have education opportunities, climate crisis. And so they're sort of demanding things that the regime is not able to provide. So I do think that that consolidation is intimately linked to the government's ability to rig or shape or influence elections, but also to how voters are kind of thinking about what options they have.
Great, thanks. Really, really helpful, which I think leads us to the next set of questions, because we've kind of talked about how they come in and consolidate power, and then how they undermine the fairness of elections. And I guess, as you were just saying about the crony capitalism and the ways that we're seeing how that influences delivery of services, but also increasingly the way that those conglomerates, whether they're called the Gang of Five or whatever, are bankrolled through sweetheart procurement deals, and then also that money flows back into re-election through various means, whether it's media or whether it's like coercing their employees or like donating to AKP charities and other projects. So as we get closer to focusing on the specific election, how do we get the election observation mission, international efforts to focus on observation, to focus on that, on the crony capitalism and the ways that it's imbalancing the election going into an election season, as opposed to these monitoring missions that are very helpful and were a great source for our work, but they tend to have these reports that are built, it almost mirrors the sort of like Western rule of law focused on the legal institutional framework, with chapters on the legal underpinnings of elections and the administrative bodies and voter and candidate registration processes and campaign finance, rather than kind of centering the analysis around the ways that cronies and oligarchs bankroll re-election campaigns for the ruling regime. So how do we make that shift and do better to focus on that in election observation?
So I guess to jump in and start with that, I think the first thing that international election observation teams need to reckon with is that while they may be able to document cases of electoral fraud potentially, they may not be able to prevent it, and they may not be able to influence the ways in which these elections are conducted in the future. So if we think about sort of the mission of electoral monitoring, and then we think about democracy promotion, often, institutions are kind of focused on both. And one of the really challenging things is, and I think this is the case certainly not just for Turkey, but for other populist authoritarian regimes, there's a vilification of international actors to the extent that they're seen as nefarious, as manipulating, as kind of these external actors that have their own interests, and so we may not need to accept them into our borders. We may not need to actually follow the rules that we're supposed to. There's all kinds of vilifying rhetoric that the regime can use to discredit these kinds of organizations and say, oh, they're plotting against us. These are saboteurs who are, anti-Muslim, or they're anti-Turkey, or they don't want to see a strong Turkey. And so therefore they're trying to undermine our rule. And, so don't take anything that they say seriously, right? We've seen Turkey respond to numerous international actors and sources of criticism, from the European Court of Human Rights to lots of others on those counts. But more specifically, in response to your question, what can they do? I have to go back to, I think, two things. One is really engaging with those who are experts from the region, not just someone who is perhaps an expert in your organization who has taken 2 years of foreign language at a university like mine, right? But have them work with people and scholars and activists and those in the region. Perhaps, and by work, I don't mean like public events, but I mean, have them follow what they're writing, have them be aware of the kinds of concerns that those regional experts from the region who are immersed in these kinds of dynamics are saying. I think we can only benefit if we're listening to those. There is, and I'm sure this is the case in Poland, Hungary, Russia, and lots of other cases, there's an immense pool of talent of people who are following precisely these things, who can, I think, really enrich the discussion if it's a two-way discussion. The second part of that is to look for practices rather than laws and things on the books. There are, as you alluded to, Josh, so many ways of studying kind of what does the Constitution say, what do the electoral laws say, what does the commission, how does it function, that kinds of things. But like, what's happening on the ground, and what is the experience of people in the voting process? And for example, are they being told, oh, don't worry, you don't have to stamp your ballot, right? Is that actually happening on the ground? There are so many disparities in the Turkish case where there are laws on the books that things should, proceed democratically. But because of the ways in which the regime has been able to sort of stack multiple institutions with people in their favor, those rules are overlooked. So I think really trying to figure out what the practice is versus just what the laws say is a really good way to have a better sense of how this actually functions.
Okay.
Yeah, I fully second what you were just saying. What I would add two things for the Polish case. So since the last election in Poland, there have been a number of decisions on the lack of judicial independence among the courts from international courts. So European Court of Human Rights has issued several decisions, the European Court of Justice of the European Union, and of course the Venice Commission has been following these really carefully. But these are starting to give shape to the judicial culture in a, from an objective, they want the courts to be functioning. It is part of EU law that these courts are functioning. It's part of the principle of mutual trust within the European Union that these courts are functioning. So as they're handing down more decisions that explain all of the ways that that is not being upheld, I think those voices need to be listened to and taken into consideration when going to observe the upcoming election. Second, I think expanding who we think of when we say election observers beyond the traditional cadre of observers. So there are people, there are organizations locally, but also internationally or regionally that are working, grassroots style movements that, as you were just saying, Lisel, that can really add color to what is actually happening on the ground. And I think incorporating more of those voices into the reports will, paint the more complete picture of the risks and afterwards of what actually happened.
I want to just underline that point. I think it's really important, and it ties into a question that came up in the Q&A, which is about Oive Ötesi, or vote and beyond. A local grassroots civic democratic platform. I think these organizations, they run big risks in terms of potentially being targeted themselves, but I think focusing on their efforts and their efforts, and this may be only particular to the Turkish case because individuals outside Turkey can vote as well. So organizing how people can volunteer, whether it's at embassies abroad or whether it's at ballot boxes at home. I think these are the platforms that really are not only the experts to speak to in terms of what are the challenges that they're facing, but also are the ones who are actually doing the work of the election monitoring as well.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for hitting multiple. We were getting multiple of these questions about election observation, which I appreciate. And yeah, it's also easier to vilify, as one of these questioners notes, the OSCE or international actors, but to the extent that local observers are empowered and lifted up, and there's a substantial body. And I know in Poland too, they're trying to build an army of 60,000 observers to have one in every polling station. That might be easier. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the vilification of international actors that you mentioned, Lisel, and obviously important in Poland as well, particularly with its history of brutal occupation. It's actually almost, and these are both sort of like former empires. I mean, even going back to like the international actors that dismantled the Ottoman Empire, these two countries have these histories that are very painful and can be invoked by strongmen to dismiss whatever is coming from abroad. So given that backdrop, what is the international community to do and to focus on over these next 6 months? Do they hold keep their powder dry until the moment of that, election night, when the biased institutions and media are prematurely calling the election? Are they ready with very strong statements then? Are they, should they be warning in advance? Are they waiting for a January 6th type thing? Like, what should they be focused on, and how do they convey their messages in a way that it's not self-defeating but actually fruitful?
Okay,
I'll go. Yeah.
I'll start again quickly on that. Conscious of time. So this is a tough one, because the recommendation that I have for international organizations, and I'm speak mostly because I'm based in DC and I traffic a lot in these circles. whether it's from the US or the EU, don't do a lot. don't necessarily vocally support the opposition. Don't necessarily have public events that are lending support to, and that may sound counterintuitive. And if there are things that can be done that are not public in ways that can support the opposition, then I think that or that can support the cause of democracy, let's say. But the narrative of US intervention in Turkey is long and deep and true and shared across the ideological spectrum. People from Turkey have a very good reason for being suspicious of European actors. You were referring to the sort of occupation of Istanbul and the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire. Sèvres syndrome is something that we talk about, the idea that these European powers are carving up Turkey, but US intervention as well. And whether that's in military coups or whether that's aid that is contingent on crushing labor unions, there's all kinds of ways in which foreign actors, and particularly the US, or the fact that Fethullah Gülen, whom the Turkish government and a lot of the Turkish people blame for the 2016 coup, resides in the United States and the US government refuses to extradite him. There's all kinds of reasons for why people in Turkey are suspicious of the US in particular, of Western actors more broadly. And so that lends credence, and the comment made in the Q&A is correct, that it's easy to vilify the OECD because in line with particular or with common populist rhetoric, you have an us and a them, and it's very easy to vilify external actors. And so any kind of declaration of support or any kind of association with actors in the opposition in Turkey can be very dangerous. You have political activists, civic activists who are in jail, kind of painted with a George Soros brush or painted with a, some kind of international actor brush. So that I think is something to be very, very cautious of. I will say that, and you alluded to this, Josh, on the day of, that's when I think that international attention, if there is an attempt to, what looks like an attempt to steal the election, any focus that can be put on the regime, I think is absolutely necessary, because what they need to, both the domestic and the international community need to make it do is to show how costly it is for the regime to continue to claim victory. And so that's kind of a political opportunity window in which international and domestic actors might be able to put immense amounts of pressure on the regime and say, no, you're not going to be able to continue to make this claim. But up until then, any kind of association with the opposition can be quite dangerous for those involved.
Yeah, and I think what Lisel's been talking about a lot is, state-led international intervention or support of any kind. So, that's complicated because of all of these legacies that you've already alluded to. I mean, in Poland, anti-German sentiment has been drummed up by peace at present, in anticipation of the election coming up, and really bringing up some, difficult historical legacies there. And with the war in Ukraine being so pressing and so present, any kind of government-led foreign interference is rightly going to be shunned by all parts of Polish society and government. But, it's not just a top-down thing, what we were talking about just before. There are international partners, not governmental organizations, that have tested and proven strategies for improving messaging in especially these closed kinds of spaces. So how can you launch an effective campaign that gets true information out there in a space where the information environment is closed or closing? So looking and relying upon those kinds of expertise, I think, is one thing that could still be done. And part of that would be building trust in the opposition within the government. So within their message, with what they plan to do, but being very clear about what that is, anything like that can build bridges with a electorate that perhaps has been following very close attention and doesn't agree with where things have been going, but wants a clear plan that's not that. So building that trust and building those messages and finding good messengers is something that can be done with the support and lessons learned from international organizations, non-governmental or very informal international networks of learning.
Great, thanks. Well, that focus on international and the need to have, especially at the state level, some restraint, but then more learning in the societal level, sort of brings us to our final question, which is, well, first of all, as we make clear in the paper, the future of these two democracies are in the hands of Turks and Poles. They will have to overcome bias and imbalance and unfairness in these processes. But it's theirs to participate and to, in their democracies in one way or another, whether it's in the election or when freedom is even challenged on the streets if needed. And so in the spirit of that and democracy being on the ballot, one final question we had here that I appreciate. We haven't really talked about the United States, but the United States suffers a lot of these challenges as well. And including in recent years in the U.S., democracy has been on the ballot. That mindset seems to have motivated voters in 2018, 2020, 2022, and then we saw President Biden announce his candidacy for 24 with some of that theme as well, perhaps particularly with youth who are looking to their future and freedom and importance of democratic institutions. We have a question about that as well, the role there. But is there a sense among Polish or Turkish voters that the upcoming elections have implications not just for policies but for freedom and democracy and institutions, and will that really drive their turnout and participation?
I mean, I think that sense of urgency is definitely there. Like I was saying, the polling of Polish citizens now show that they're not content with what they have, and so they also are a country that fought very hard for their democracy, and so going back to a clean election and using the ballot box to return Poland to the kind of government that they want to see, I think is very much something that I hope that we see happen, and then that is very possible. We've seen also an uptick in turnout among the Polish citizens since 2015 to 2019. So if that trajectory continues, we might also see that come into play here.
I would say that the sense of urgency is certainly there in the Turkish case as well. I think, people said this about the 2018 election, but I think they're saying it even more now because of the de-democratization that's happened since then. Particularly, against women, against LGBTQ, against Kurds. So I think that there's that sense of urgency. The public is very polarized, again, in the sense that, the opposition and the pro-government alliance, it's not that there's, 4% support for the pro-government alliance. There's it fluctuates. Sometimes it goes down as far as 33%. Sometimes the poll for Erdogan goes up to close to 50%. But there is a lot of support there. But what I think will be important to watch in terms of kind of the urgency of this is women's vote. About 33% of the women who voted for the AKP in 2018 said they won't again. Now, not all of them say they'll vote for the opposition. Many are undecided and may not vote, but I think that's important. The 7 million youth who are going to be voting for the first time, I think, have a lot to say about this. And again, and there was a question in the chat about that, so I just want to address super quickly. Up until relatively recently, I think the youth have been really disillusioned by the political messaging that they've been receiving. There's like rap videos and made by the government, and there's Spotify lists that are being distributed, and kind of all these, kind of cool tools to try to impress the youth, but they want jobs, and they want, a clean environment, and they want all kinds of things that they haven't really been promised. And so I think that the opposition is now realizing that and kind of trying to address more tangible issues. And then the Kurdish vote is absolutely key. We saw that in the 2019 mayoral election in Istanbul. You can see both the opposition and the incumbent fighting for the Kurdish vote. So it's pivotal. There's a sense of urgency. I'm very concerned about the fact that the opposition sees that as pivotal, and that if the government calls victory and the opposition goes into the streets, that there may be violence used. So I'm very concerned about that. And again, going back to the previous question, that's when the international community really needs to keep the spotlight on this, put the pressure on the government, and not let them, if they were to try to get away with stealing an election through fraud or violence.
Right. Well, that is all we have time for on that note. I mean, thank you. Thank you so much for lending your expertise and tying it all together. Professor Lisel Hintz, Dr. Cassandra Emmons, thank you. Thank you also to my co-authors at ASD, Nathan Kohlenberg, Krisha Sikora. These are the 4 individuals that you all should be following and listening to over what's going to be a critically important 6 months for the defense of democracy. So thanks for tuning in, and take care, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.